Raise your hand if you've been personally victimized by that weird perfume clip with Huda from Love Island. Okay, now put your hands down. Now, raise your hands if you thought that was real. If you didn't just raise your hand, good job. If you did, good luck, because there's a lot more where that came from.
It's called Angham by Latafa.
If you're anything like me, when you first saw that clip, you were like, wait, isn't this illegal? Well, yes, it was because of false endorsement laws and she was endorsing something she didn't agree to. But like creating a deepfake video of someone else without their permission and posting it online, even if it's misleading? No, it's not. So yes, legally this can happen to you too. Someone could just use your face, put words in your mouth, and spread it online without asking. And unless you can prove it caused serious damage to your reputation, defamation laws aren't gonna help you either. And that's exactly the type of loophole NoFakes is trying to close with all of this recent AI development. However, NoFakes, short for Nurture Originals, Foster Art, and Keep Entertainment Safe Act, has received a controversial update that critics warn could lead to over-censorship. In it, the bill defines a digital replica as a newly created, computer-generated, highly realistic electronic representation that is readily identifiable as the voice or visual likeness of an individual. In simpler terms, we're talking about deepfakes. AI-generated clones of people so realistic that day by day are becoming nearly impossible to distinguish from the real thing. At its core, the NoFakes Act is about protecting people from having their likeness used without consent and giving individuals more control of their own identity in the age of AI. But somehow, someway, instead of uniting people around a shared concern, being deepfaked, this has turned into a debate about political abuse and over-censorship. But before we get into all that, let's take a look at the text and see what it actually says. First, the basics. An online service refers to any platform, app, or virtual environment where users can upload and share their own content. That includes social media sites, forums, virtual reality platforms, even mobile apps built around user-generated material. Next up, right holder. That is the person who owns the legal rights to a specific face or voice. That might be the individual themselves while they're alive, or their estate or authorized representative after death. They're the ones who can legally give permission to create a digital replica of that person. Now let's talk about the digital replication right, a concept central to the NoFakes Act. This is a legal protection that says no one can use a digital version of your face or voice without your consent. The digital replication right blends elements of both copyright law and the right of publicity. For example, like copyright, it is considered a property right, which has implications for how it interacts with laws like Section 230, but we'll get to that later. It can be licensed, but not permanently sold or assigned, mirroring publicity rights. It continues after death, but must be transferred by a legal representative, just like in the right of publicity. And while someone is alive, licenses to use their image or voice can only last up to 10 years at a time, borrowing from the concept of fixed duration licenses under copyright law. But to be clear, you do not need a license to protect your likeness or file a lawsuit. If someone uses your face, voice, or other identifiable traits without consent, you will be able to take legal action as the default right holder. Licenses only come into play when you're choosing to rent out or authorize use of your likeness, essentially giving someone permission to use your identity under specific terms, which would be more common for celebrities and the like. Since this digital replication right is a hybrid between the two, let's take a look how the right of publicity and copyright law function today. Let's start with the right of publicity. This is a legal protection that exists only at the state level, not federally. In many states like California and New York, it is illegal to use someone's name, image, or likeness without consent when it's for commercial gain. In other words, if you profit from someone's identity without permission, you may be violating their publicity rights. However, if there's no commercial benefit, it's not considered a violation. That's why it's often described as protection against unauthorized commercial exploitation, not against all use of a person's likeness. There's also the concept of assignment. While your right of publicity can be licensed, it typically can't be permanently sold or transferred. It stays with you or your estate even after death. However, these rights don't override free speech protections, which brings us to a key limitation of the right of publicity. It cannot override First Amendment rights. The First Amendment protects a wide range of expressive works, including satire, parody, commentary, and journalism. even when the real person's name or likeness is used without consent. Courts have upheld that such uses are protected speech, especially when the work is transformative, meaning it adds new meaning or commentary, and non-commercial, meaning it's not trying to sell something using that person's identity. These free speech protections not only affect the right of publicity, but are also closely mirrored in copyright law using the fair use doctrine. Title 17 of the U.S. Code governs federal copyright law. Under Section 106, it states copyright holders have exclusive rights to reproduce, distribute, and publicly display their work. However, Section 107, the fair use provision, allows others the right to use the copyright holder's work without permission for certain use cases, particularly for criticism, parody, commentary, teaching, and education. Examples of this distinction can be seen in key legal precedents. In 1988, the Supreme Court ruled in Hustler magazine versus Falwell that a satirical parody ad, though offensive, was protected under the First Amendment. The court emphasized that parody, even when controversial, plays a critical role in free expression. Then there's ETW Corp versus Jiglr Publishing from 2003, where an artist's painting of Tiger Woods was ruled to be an expressive work, not merely commercial exploitation. Even though it used Woods' likeness, the creative and transformative nature of the art outweighed the publicity claim. Contrast that with Comedy 3 Productions versus Satirup from 2001. In this case, a charcoal drawing of the Three Stooges reproduced and sold on t-shirts was not transformative enough. The court sided with the estate, ruling that it violated California's right of publicity law. Even something like a mural of a celebrity could, in certain states, trigger a right of publicity violation if it's used for commercial gain without consent. And the same mural could evoke copyright infringement if it is based on a photo someone else took. These cases illustrate an important point. It's not just about whether someone's likeness was used, it's about how and why. That's why celebrities like Tom Cruise rarely win lawsuits over shows like South Park. Satirical portrayals are often protected by fair use and the First Amendment, as long as they're transformative and not purely commercial. Now let's start to take a look on how copyright law works on the World Wide Web. Most copyright disputes are governed by the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, or DMCA, specifically Section 512, also known as the Online Copyright Infringement Liability Limitation Act. Passed in 1998, this law created conditional safe harbor protections for online service providers, including platforms like YouTube. The safe harbor clause clarifies, as long as the service provider follows the required takedown procedures, they won't be held responsible for a copyright infringement involving the content identified in the notice. This is the legal core of DMCA's liability shield. Under Section 512, platforms are shielded from 3 types of liability: direct liability for uploading infringing content themselves, secondary liability for what users upload, and more specifically, contributory liability, which means being held responsible for knowingly enabling or ignoring infringement. But that protection isn't automatic. Platforms only qualify if they meet certain conditions, like promptly removing infringing content after receiving a valid takedown notice. This system is known as notice and takedown. Under Section 512C, a copyright holder can submit a formal takedown request, and if the platform disables the content and follows the correct procedures, it avoids liability and thereby avoids the need for court involvement. Platforms must first register a designated agent with the U.S. Copyright Office, someone responsible for handling takedown notices. This information is published in a public directory so right holders can easily contact platforms. The DMCA doesn't just protect copyright holders. It also includes a process to protect users when content is taken down in error. This is handled through what's known as the counter notice procedure under Section 512G. If a user believes their content was wrongly removed, such as in cases of fair use, they can submit a counter notification to the platform. The platform is then required to notify the original complainant. If that complainant does not file a lawsuit within 10 to 14 business days, the platform is allowed to restore the content. This process is a core part of DMCA's safe harbor system, giving users a path to defend their rights while protecting platforms from having to choose sides in complex copyright disputes. The DMCA subpoena, which is Section 512H, is different from a regular takedown. It's a legal request sent to a court clerk asking them to force a platform to reveal who uploaded the content. This could mean giving up a name, an IP address, or whatever user info the platform has. Now, this exists because users upload content anonymously, and platforms usually won't hand over their data unless they're legally required to. Here's where it gets messy. Often companies obtain subpoenas even when the content clearly qualifies as fair use. Because courts are so overwhelmed, clerks will issue subpoenas automatically, relying solely on the copyright holder's statements, as long as the paperwork looks right. So, if a company claims copyright infringement, even when it's clearly fair use, they can still get a subpoena. And unless the platform fights it in court, and they rarely ever do because it takes time, money, and risk, the user's info gets handed over. This can mean potentially exposing a whistleblower or someone posting lawful satire or commentary, all without any real oversight. Platforms don't want to get tangled up in legal battles because lawsuits cost money. That's why they go out of their way to follow the DMCA's safe harbor rules. They act on takedown notices, remove infringing content, and keep repeat offender policies. And by doing so, they avoid all liability and end up paying little to nothing in penalties each year, even if the content was actually infringing. Now, a lot of that protection comes from prevention and not reaction. Take YouTube, for example. It uses an internal system called Content ID to catch potential copyright issues early, before anything escalates into subpoenas or lawsuits. And here's the thing. Content ID isn't a legal process. Unless the rights holder actually files a formal DMCA takedown, no legal notice is triggered. That means bots can flag videos with almost no accountability, and the whole dispute stays inside YouTube's own system. Because of that system, and you guessed it, YouTube pays virtually nothing in DMCA-related penalties. How do they catch copyright infringement issues early? Digital fingerprints. The No Fakes Act defines it as a unique code, like a digital ID, that's created using a special math formula called a hash function. Basically, it tags a file, like a photo, video, or audio clip, with a signature so specific that even if something looks similar, it won't have the same fingerprint. Platforms use this to spot and track exact copies, especially to catch reposts of stuff that's already been flagged. The key thing to remember here is copyright filters aren't legally required. There is no law enforcing platforms to use them. In 2015, the US Copyright Office released a study evaluating how well Section 512 of the DMCA was working. There, it reminded us that providers are not required to filter out or prevent the reposting of copyrighted content through the use of content identification technologies or other means. These copyright filters are voluntary. Platforms use them not because the law requires it, but to reduce legal risk and preserve their safe harbor protections. Despite not being legally required, automated copyright filters are now widely used to block uploads before they go public. Many complain that these systems often lack context needed to identify fair use cases, leading to the mistaken flagging of legitimate content such as parody, education, or commentary, raising serious free speech concerns. When the DMCA was passed in 1998, Congress rejected mandatory filtering to safeguard free expression, a clear contrast to the EU's Article 17, which requires platforms to proactively block copyrighted content. Yet, ironically, despite the US being more permissive on paper, the outcome is the same. Platforms overfilter to protect themselves. What then is the purpose of safe harbor protections if platforms are going to overcorrect anyway, copying stricter free speech limits from other countries? And now with laws like No Fakes coming into play, are we doubling down in that direction? So now let's go back to No Fakes and see what's actually new and what's just more of the same. Let's start with the safe harbor provision, the legal shield that many say are being seriously weakened by the No Fakes Act. Critics argue it could discourage innovation by holding platforms and developers liable not for what they do, but for how others use their tools. Under DMCA, developers are protected if their tools have substantial lawful uses, even if some people misuse them. This stems from the Supreme Court decision in Sony versus Universal that established the Betamax clause. In 1984, Universal Studios sued Sony for selling the Betamax VCR, claiming it enabled copyright infringement because users could record TV shows without permission. Sony argued that the VCR had other uses, like recording a show to watch later, which is legal. The Supreme Court ruled that manufacturers aren't liable if their device has substantial legal uses. But under no-fakes, it's no longer enough just to have lawful uses. The tool's primary use becomes the deciding factor. A tool loses protection if it falls into one of these high-risk categories. Is primarily used to design and create unauthorized digital replicas, has no other substantial use, or is marketed for impersonating real people without consent. Take Synthesia, for example. It markets itself as a business video tool. It allows avatar creation, but requires legal consent, screens for abuse, and has broader use cases like training videos. It also offers preset avatars and video editing tools, showing that its purpose goes beyond just replication. Therefore, it avoids liability. Now, imagine a fictional app like Deep Real Celebrity Chat, which lets users generate hyper-realistic video calls with celebrities. It's marketed with slogans like "Talk to Tom Cruise," and mostly used to generate unauthorized celebrity deepfakes. If 5% of the users used it for fun, but the other 95% began using it to impersonate stars, that would trigger liability under no-fakes. That's the shift. The DMCA asks if a tool can be used lawfully. No-fakes asks if it mainly is. Now, for platforms that link to or host deepfakes, they won't be held liable if they meet 4 conditions. Let's break those down. Condition 1, a repeat violator policy. The platform has to have a written policy that bans repeat offenders, is clearly communicated to user, and is actually enforced, not just there for show. If they slip up with one user, they're liable for that user's content, not for everything on the platform. Condition 2, prompt takedowns. Once a valid takedown request comes in, the platform has to remove or block access to the deepfake itself, the tool or product that created it, or even links pointing to it. And they've got to do it as soon as feasibly possible. Condition 3, stop future uploads. For platforms that primarily host user-uploaded content, if they get a valid notice, they also have to block future uploads of that same content, but only if it matches the digital fingerprint of what was already flagged and it's uploaded after the takedown was processed. So no, they don't have to scan everything all the time. In fact, the No Fakes Act explicitly clarifies that platforms do not have to constantly monitor user uploads all of the time. This no duty to monitor clause provides room for platforms to breathe, ensuring they aren't forced into mass surveillance. Their obligation doesn't kick in until after they get legal notice. But once they've been alerted, especially through something like a fingerprint-based takedown, they are required to ensure they block any re-uploads. Condition 4, notify both parties. Once content is taken down, the platform has to notify both the person whose likeness was used and the user who uploaded it. So the real takeaway here is platforms aren't liable for what users upload. They're liable for what they ignore, a point that is further explained in the notice or knowledge required provision. Liability under no fakes depends on what the platform knows. A platform is only liable if it gets formal takedown notice, is served a court order, or willfully avoids the truth, like purposely ignoring complaints, blocking emails, or designing their platform to never see these issues. In legal terms, this closes the plausible deniability loophole. You can't just say, "I didn't know," if you deliberately looked away. And even if you're upfront about what you're doing, that does not protect you. For example, if someone uploads a video with a label that says, "This was made with AI," or "This isn't real," that doesn't get them off the hook. The No Fakes Act makes it clear. Disclaimers don't excuse violations, and platforms must take it down to maintain safe harbor protections. If they refuse, relying on the disclaimer as a reason to leave it up, they risk being held liable. But what if a platform genuinely believes the content isn't a deepfake? That's where the next protection comes in. If a platform receives a takedown request, reviews the content, and determines the material isn't a deepfake, objectively reasonable belief, meaning the platform isn't just guessing, but is relying on established industry standards, it's protected from the statutory fine. And the statutory fines are steep. $5,000 per violation for individuals, and up to $25,000 for platforms, especially if they ignore complaints or fail to follow proper takedown procedures. So if later a court says that the platform was wrong and it was a deepfake, the platform would only owe the actual provable harm caused, like financial loss or reputational harm. Without this clause, platforms might panic and remove everything just to stay safe. No fakes ensures here that platforms won't be punished for honest mistakes. Platforms also aren't punished if a takedown turns out to be wrong. If the original uploader files a lawsuit within 14 days of the takedown, the platform is legally allowed to restore the content without being held liable for either side. This gives platforms a safe way to reverse takedowns when there's a legitimate dispute, without having to choose sides or risk getting sued. Without this clause, many would just keep the content offline to play it safe, even if the claim was obviously false. Also, just like in copyright and the right of publicity laws, no fakes includes protections grounded in First Amendment and fair use principles. That means news reporting, public affairs segments, and sports coverage are allowed as long as the deepfake is relevant to the story. Documentaries and biographical films can use replicas too, even with some fictional elements, unless they mislead viewers into thinking the person actually participated. It also protects satire, parody, commentary, criticism, and academic work. And fleeting or background uses like a brief cameo in a crowd shot are excluded as well. Finally, the No Fakes Act explicitly classifies itself as an intellectual property law, which places it under Section 230 E2 of the Communications Act. That matters because Section 230 protections don't apply to IP laws, meaning platforms can be held directly liable for deepfakes uploaded by users even if they didn't create them. This isn't new. The DMCA is also excluded from Section 230, but here's the difference. The DMCA provides more reactive guidelines. Platforms avoid liability as long as they respond appropriately after receiving valid takedown notices. In contrast, the No Fakes Act introduces more proactive requirements. Platforms and developers can be held directly liable if they fail to remove flagged content, allow matching replicas to reappear, or ignore formal notices or court orders. This marks a shift in how liability is structured, tightening the standards platforms must meet to remain protected. On paper, this sounds like a dramatic shift, but we've already seen this in practice with platforms like YouTube that have already implemented proactive tools like Content ID. In fact, YouTube has already started enforcing its own deepfake style violations under its privacy complaint process. Even before federal law mandated it, users can now request removal of AI-generated or altered content that uses their faces or voice without consent. These complaints are evaluated based on how realistic the content is, whether the person is identifiable, whether the video discloses that it's synthetic, and whether it involves parody, satire, or public interest. So while YouTube systems don't use the phrase "the right of publicity," they've already begun operating in its spirit, banning impersonation, misleading endorsements, and unauthorized digital likenesses. The tools may differ, but the enforcement logic is already taking shape. So for the biggest players, the real change won't be the technology, it'll be the liability. What was once voluntary is now enforceable. And given the long-standing criticism of automated filtering, the question now becomes, will no fakes worsen these conditions? Pushback against the No Fakes Act mirrors the same freedom of speech concerns that surfaced during earlier internet legislation, especially the rollout of DMCA. Many of the voices raising alarms today are the same ones who did decades ago. Back in 1988, during debates over the Communications Decency Act, groups like the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the ACLU warned that such laws posed a serious threat to online expression. One ACLU legislative consultant put it plainly: the bill would criminalize constitutionally protected speech between adults. Even a coalition of 13 civil liberties groups wrote an open letter calling it constitutionally suspect. But in hindsight, those fears didn't fully materialize. The law didn't criminalize speech. What came after was something more moderate: content filters, stricter moderation, and evolving platform policies. Far from perfect, but also far from the dystopian censorship many people feared. And now we're seeing a similar pattern with no fakes. But if history tells us anything, it's that early panic doesn't always match reality. At this point, I'm more concerned about how political leanings might be shaping how we perceive the threat rather than the actual text itself. For example, the No Fakes Act seems to be building on the recently passed Take It Down Act. designed to help individuals, particularly minors, remove non-consensual intimate imagery off the internet. While the premise was broadly supported, the bill drew criticism. One YouTube segment framed it as a free speech killer, which took me aback, considering the bill's stated goals was simply to require covered platforms to remove non-consensual intimate visual depictions. As I continued watching, a political leaning, particularly anti-Trump, began to emerge. The host suggested that the bill would create a lot of room for abuse, prompting a guest expert from a civil liberties organization to respond that the president himself previewed this for us, while also referencing an EFF article titled, "Trump calls on Congress to pass the Take It Down Act so he can censor his critics." The discussion also referenced a well-known tech editor who suggested the law might have functioned better under a prior administration, which I found to be an odd claim given the recent censorship history of both parties. For example, Mark Zuckerberg recently admitted that in 2021, the previous Biden administration repeatedly pushed Facebook to suppress misinformation related to the pandemic. But in hindsight, many of the statements labeled as correct information at the time, including guidance from Dr. Fauci himself, turned out to lack solid scientific basis. For example, Fauci later acknowledged that the widely enforced 6 feet apart rule wasn't grounded in definitive research, but sort of just appeared. The fact of the matter is, both Republican and Democratic leadership have both played their hand in censorship. For example, in April 2020, under the Trump administration, Meta started removing posts claiming COVID was man-made, based on the World Health Organization's guidance, though this was done in cooperation with health authorities, not due to direct executive pressure. By February 2021, post-election under Biden, Meta escalated its ban, explicitly censoring lab leak theories. It was later revealed that this move was made under White House pressure. Then, by May 2021, as agents reconsidered the lab leak theory plausible, Meta walked the policy back. It's worth noting that some of the same groups now raising concerns about deepfake legislation have previously supported stronger platform moderation in other contexts, seemingly based on party bias. Take the Electronic Frontier Foundation, whose article originally drew my attention to the no fakes issue. Media Bias Fact Check notes that EFF's reporting is factual and well-sourced, but it also tends to report critically on Republican administrations and favorably on Democratic ones. This raises a key question. Are critics genuinely concerned about government overreach, or are we seeing selective outrage based on political alignment? For example, in the same YouTube segment as before, the guest expert argued that the law could give Trump the power to censor citizens while also failing actual victims, calling it weaponized under enforcement, implying legitimate victims wouldn't have the recourse they need and are supposed to have under the law. However, they didn't explain how such a contradiction would work, especially since the law mandates takedowns within 48 hours, which should, in theory, apply equally to all parties. Now, I'm not saying the criticism is wrong. I just think we should focus less on the administration that's in power and more on breaking down what the bill actually says. Personally, I'd prefer discussions that move beyond political framing, ones that really help the public understand how the law works and where it might fall short. Again, my concern here isn't who's right or wrong politically. My point here is, are we catastrophizing a bill that might be far less severe than politically biased alarmists might suggest? I'm not an expert, I'm just a curious citizen trying to figure out how this legislation will work. And in doing so, I've noticed something. There's a lot of noise, strong opinions, bold headlines, and heavy political framing. But maybe we might need less panic and more patience. Instead of focusing on who's in office and worst case scenarios, I think we should talk more about how this law will realistically change things. The No Fakes Act isn't insignificant, but it's also not the end of the internet. If anything, it's a reflection of how we're still trying to catch up legally with what's possible technologically. Let's stay critical, but also curious. So, how do you want your face to be protected on the internet? Thanks so much for watching. I know this week was something a lot different from what I've been posting recently, but I really wanted to make a video about it because not too long ago I made a blog post about it and it's been weighing on me, so I decided to give it a go. If you liked this, please give it a thumbs up, leave a comment below, let me know if there's anything you'd like to talk about next. I can definitely take that into account and try to make a video about that as well. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one. Bye!